Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we are going to be taking a close look at a truly fascinating piece of writing, The Liberation of Intellect, Neohumanism by Prabhat, Ranjan, Sarkar.
Yes.
Now, just from the title alone, you can tell we are in for something pretty profound.
Right.
And this work is actually a collection of 11 discourses that Sarkar gave between December 1981 and March 82.
Yeah.
And one thing that really stood out to me right from the beginning was his intentional inclusion of English terms for like all these key concepts, which kind of suggests right off the bat that he really wanted these ideas to resonate like on a global scale, not just within, specific cultural or linguistic boundaries.
Absolutely. He wasn't content with simply preaching to the choir, so to speak.
Right, exactly.
He was looking to engage with a wider world to spark a global conversation. And that's what makes this so relevant even today.
Right. So I guess that brings us to the mission of our deep dive today, which is to really unpack those central ideas of neo-humanism as presented in these excerpts. And we'll be looking specifically at how this philosophy relates to devotion, that deep connection to something greater than ourselves, and how it sets itself apart from other, more limited sentiments, like the love for one's own land, which he calls geo-sentiment, and the favoring of one's social group, known as socio-sentiment.
All right.
So, even the dedication at the beginning, to those who think for all.
Yeah.
It just sets such a powerful tone,
It does.
It immediately tells you this is a philosophy rooted in universal respect.
Yeah.
In valuing others, whoever and wherever they might be.
Yeah, it's about breaking down barriers.
Exactly. So let's start by exploring this connection between devotional sentiment and neo-humanism a little bit more.
Okay.
In that very first discourse, Sarkar lays out this relationship pretty clearly, and he describes how we can reach the highest point of devotion through what he calls a subjective approach through objective adjustment, which is a very interesting way of putting it. And what really grabbed my attention there was how he highlights the interplay, between our inner experience and the external world.
Yeah. It's like he's saying, you can't just focus inward. You have to be in tune with what's happening around you.
Right, exactly. It's like he's using the analogy of tuning an instrument, where your inner sense of harmony, it needs to align with the actual sounds that are being produced. Otherwise, you're just going to be making noise.
I like that analogy.
Right. So he's saying that there's this rhythmic quality to our inner psychic movements, right?
Okay.
And when what's happening around us aligns with that internal rhythm, that's when we experience a sense of well-being. We feel comfortable. Things feel right.
Right. And conversely, when things are out of sync, when there's that disharmony between our internal state and the external environment, that's when we start to feel off.
Exactly. We've all felt that, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Everyone has those days.
Where things just don't quite click.
When you're just not in the groove.
Exactly. Yeah. So Sarkar actually links this to the increasing number of psychic disorders that were being observed, particularly among educated people at the time. Right. And his argument is that even though intellectual progress was, advancing at an incredible pace, the external world wasn't necessarily keeping up. And this lack of alignment between the speed and rhythm of our inner lives and what's going on around us can create a kind of a mental unease.
It's almost like we're overstimulated. Our minds are racing, but our surroundings aren't designed to handle that pace.
Exactly. So it's this really insightful observation, especially considering the historical context of these talks. And from there he moves on to kind of look at past theories, past attempts to understand the human condition. And he notes that some of them focus purely on the spiritual without really a rational basis, whereas others, they were more focused on the physical world but lacked that connection to the practical realities of human experience.
Okay, so he's seeing kind of a disconnect.
These fragmented approaches.
A gap between theory and lived experience.
Exactly. And it's almost like, he's paving the way for a more integrated, more holistic understanding of human existence.
He's setting the stage for a more comprehensive perspective.
Right. So then he brings in this really key concept. He addresses this whole idea of human equality, and he introduces this really important Sanskrit phrase, which translates to diversity, not identity, is the law of nature.
That's a powerful statement.
Right. It really is. And it's like he's emphasizing the inherent like dynamism, the variety, the multiplicity, that exists within human existence. And he's cautioning us, right, against those rigid dogmatic philosophies that try to ignore this fundamental truth.
Right. It's about embracing the richness of human difference.
Exactly. And he actually goes on to use the analogy of a pool of water. When water is stagnant, it becomes unhealthy, it breeds problems.
Oh, I see. He's drawing a parallel to human societies.
Right.
Saying that if we try to force everyone into the same mold, we stifle our collective potential.
Exactly. And it's within this context, right, that he introduces devotional sentiment as humanity's like most prized possession, It's our highest and most valuable treasure, in his words.
Wow.
And he even goes so far as to refer to Krishna as the Vaduya money, the brightest jewel of the human heart, which is it's just a beautiful image,
It's evocative.
It is. And it really speaks to the power and the depth of this devotional sentiment. But, he also emphasizes that this precious sentiment, it needs to be protected.
Oh, good.
There needs to be a kind of a protective fence around it to shield it from the pressures of the material world. And this fence, in his view, is a sound philosophy.
Okay.
One that brings harmony, between the spiritual and the material, and one that continually inspires progress in society.
So it's not about rejecting the material world?
No, not at all.
It's about finding a balance.
Exactly. It's about integration.
A harmonious coexistence.
Right. Okay. So we've laid some groundwork here in terms of, Neohumanism and its connection to devotion.
Right.
Now let's dive into what Sarkar calls geo-sentiment. What exactly does he mean by that? And why does he see it as potentially problematic, from a neo-humanistic perspective?
Okay, so geo-sentiment, as he defines it, is basically this attachment to one's native land.
Okay.
And all those different feelings that come with it, like patriotism, for example.
Like a strong national identity?
Exactly. Geoeconomics, so prioritizing your own nation's economic interests above others. Even geo-religion, the idea that your religion is somehow tied to a specific geographic location.
Okay.
And the main issue Sarkar has with geo-sentiment is that it ultimately tries to limit humanity.
Confine us, yeah.
Yeah, to keep us boxed in within the borders of a particular geographic area.
Right, which, kind of clashes with this whole idea of humans having this innate desire for expansion, right?
Exactly. He argues that we're naturally drawn to reach beyond our immediate surroundings, to explore, to connect with the wider world.
It's like we have this inherent curiosity.
And a thirst for knowledge.
Yeah, and geo-sentiment can kind of stifle that.
It puts up walls.
Right, exactly.
Limits our horizons.
And he really contrasts this restrictive nature of geo-sentiment with the transformative power of devotional sentiment.
Right. So on the one hand, you have this inward-looking perspective, focused on a limited geographical area. And on the other hand, you have this expansive, outward-reaching sentiment,
which has the potential to lift us beyond our earthly limitations.
Exactly. He argues that genuine devotion has this power to elevate our earthly existence to a supreme spiritual level.
That's like a transcendence of the mundane.
And it makes you think, doesn't it, about how much of the conflict we see in the world today stems from this very idea of prioritizing us based on where we happen to have been born.
It's like those arbitrary lines on a map become these huge dividing lines between people.
Exactly. We cling to these imagined boundaries, and in the process, we lose sight of our common humanity.
It's really kind of tragic when you think about it.
It is.
So, what Sarkar is saying is that even if someone has material wealth, if their perspective is limited by this geo-sentiment, it can actually lead to a sense of emptiness, of lack.
It's like a spiritual poverty.
Yeah, exactly. They might have all the material comforts, but there's still a void inside.
A longing for something more.
Right. And he goes on to point out the historical harm that has been caused by this geo-sentiment.
Oh.
All the conflicts, the divisions, the wars that have been fueled by this kind of thinking. And he's very direct in his critique of it. He urges intelligent people to steer clear of it.
To rise above those narrow sentiments, to see the bigger picture.
Exactly. Because he believes that it ultimately contaminates that precious devotional sentiment.
It pollutes our capacity for love and compassion.
Yeah, and it diminishes our human potential.
It keeps us stuck in a cycle of conflict and division.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about geo-sentiment. Now let's move on to socio-sentiment.
Right.
How does that differ from geo-sentiment and, what are its limitations from a neo-humanistic perspective?
Well, socio-sentiment is a bit broader than geo-sentiment.
All right.
It's not just about attachment to a particular territory. It's about the well-being of a specific social group.
So your tribe, so to speak.
Exactly. So it's a step beyond those geographical limitations, but it still involved prioritizing one group over others.
It's still drawing those lines.
It is. It's like an us versus them mentality, but defined by social categories rather than national borders.
So it's like instead of my country is better than yours, it's my group is better than yours.
Precisely. And while Sarkar acknowledges that it's a more expansive view than geo-sentiment, he still sees it as flawed.
Okay.
He highlights the historical consequences of socio-sentiment, the bloodshed, the divisions, the distrust, all the things that have hindered human progress.
It's that same image of a stagnant pool.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. It restricts the natural flow and interconnectedness of humanity.
Instead of that flowing river that represents, the true potential of human connection.
That's a great analogy.
Now, this brings us to the concept of human sentiment itself.
Okay.
And Sarkar has some really thought-provoking examples that illustrate this idea.
Oh, I'm curious.
He talks about those who express, deep concern for suffering humanity, but they seem to be indifferent to the suffering of non-human creatures.
Interesting.
He gives this example of people who might be moved by human plight, but then they readily consume fish without any consideration for the pain that those creatures might be experiencing.
So there's a kind of selective compassion.
Right, like their empathy has limits.
It stops at the species boundary.
Yeah, exactly. And then he tells this story about a saint who only ate honey-dipped locusts.
Okay.
And on the surface, it might seem like a very simple, pure diet. But he's highlighting the fact that these creatures also possessed a vital life force.
Right.
They were living beings.
And their suffering was disregarded.
Exactly. And these examples, they really make you think about how we apply our compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we draw those lines?
They challenge us to examine our own biases.
Exactly. And to expand our circle of concern.
To recognize the interconnectedness of all living things.
Right. So then he brings up the concept of rational behavior, and the need to adjust to the external environment.
Yeah.
He mentions this phrase, jivasya bhojanam, which translates to living beings are the food for other living beings.
So he's acknowledging this natural order.
Exactly. It's the part of life.
But at the same time, he's prompting us to consider the scope of our empathy.
Yeah, and to act with awareness.
To be mindful of the impact our choices have on other creatures.
Precisely. So he's recognizing this natural order, but he's also emphasizing that concern for the vital rhythm in other human creatures is what drives humanism. But, for Sarkar, this isn't the final destination.
It's a stepping stone.
Right. The crucial step, the next step, is expanding that feeling to include all creatures in the universe.
Wow, so it's about taking humanism to a whole new level.
Exactly. It's this move towards neo-humanism, which he describes as the final consummation of human existence.
The ultimate expression of our potential.
Yeah. And to really illustrate this, he includes this beautiful Sanskrit quote, which essentially translates to, "This manifested universe is the expression of Vizal, the latent, all-pervading entity. Therefore, a wise person should look upon everything as his or her own from an integral viewpoint."
It's like he's saying that we're all part of this grand cosmic tapestry.
Exactly. And we need to see ourselves and everything around us as interconnected expressions of that same divine source.
So neo-humanism isn't just a broader form of humanism, it's a fundamental shift to universalism.
Exactly. It's a cult of love for all created beings of this universe, as Sarkar describes it.
A celebration of the unity and interconnectedness of all things.
Right. And he explains that all these seemingly distinct elements, molecules, atoms, planets, stars,
everything,
they're all expressions of that same supreme consciousness. And those who truly grasp this, who live in accordance with this understanding, those are the real devotees.
It's about seeing the divine in everything.
Exactly. So it's like devotional practice is evolving, beyond just rituals and outward forms to become this profound sentiment, this guiding mission.
A way of life.
Yeah, a way of understanding our place in the cosmos.
Yeah.
And when that aligns with an expanded sense of humanism that includes all life, that's when you arrive at neo-humanism.
That's a beautiful synthesis.
It is. It's this recognition of our interconnectedness, both with the divine and with all living beings.
And Sarkar argues that this realization comes with a certain responsibility.
Oh, okay.
He outlines a kind of dual task for human beings. The internal psycho-spiritual journey towards that supreme consciousness, guided by these neo-humanistic principles, and the external effort to actually build a social framework based on this universalism by expanding those humanistic ideals into the world around us.
So it's about both inner transformation and outer action.
It is. It's about aligning our individual lives with this expanded consciousness, and then working to create a world that reflects those values.
And he brings us back to those limited sentiments like geo-sentiment and the dangers of clinging to them. He stresses that it can really throw us off balance.
It creates a dissonance.
Yeah, between our inner and outer worlds.
And it prevents us from reaching our full potential.
Exactly. It's like we're holding ourselves back.
We're limiting ourselves with these arbitrary boundaries.
Right. And he concludes by really reaffirming that devotional sentiment is our most valuable possession, and it's something that we need to protect.
To nurture.
Yeah, to safeguard from all those external pressures that are constantly trying to pull us away from that connection with something greater than ourselves.
It's a reminder to stay true to our core values.
Exactly. So to kind of bring it all together, this deep dive into these excerpts, Neohumanism, as Sarkar presents it, is a philosophy that's deeply rooted in devotion. It's about transcending those restrictive, divisive sentiments like geo-sentiment and socio-sentiment and cultivating this universal love for all beings and objects, recognizing them as expressions of a single supreme consciousness.
It's a beautiful vision.
It is. It's a vision of a world where we've moved beyond those arbitrary boundaries.
Where we see ourselves as part of something much larger than ourselves.
Exactly. It's a world where compassion and understanding extend to all beings, regardless of species, nationality, or social group.
A world where our interconnectedness is not just an idea, but a lived reality.
That's a powerful message. It really gives you a lot to think about. So here's a final thought for you to ponder.
Okay.
How might consciously embracing this neo-humanistic perspective, with its emphasis on both inner spiritual growth and this outward universalism, reshape how we understand the challenges that we face in the world today?
The challenges that are so often rooted in those very divisions that Sarkar is talking about.
Exactly. I mean, think about the practical implications. If we could truly extend our empathy and our sense of interconnectedness beyond our traditional boundaries.
It's a challenge, for sure.
It is, but it's also an invitation.
An invitation to imagine a better world.
A world where we recognize our shared humanity and our shared connection to something much greater than ourselves.
It's a vision worth striving for.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.
Bye.